Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello and welcome to another episode on the New Books Network. I'm one of your hosts, Dr. Miranda Melcher, and I'm very pleased today to be speaking with Dr. Mark Valeri about his book titled The Opening of the Protestant Mind, How Anglo-American Protestants Embraced Religious Liberty, published by Oxford University Press in 2023. This book is really interesting because it takes us kind of from one place to another, a fascinating transformation of a really important period of English colonization in North America. We'll get to that time period in a moment. But really what we're talking about here is a transformation of ways of thinking about Protestantism, about Catholicism, about Islam, about a whole bunch of things, about Anglo-Americans in Britain, in America, or what became America, about different native indigenous peoples as well, and kind of how all of these different thoughts and political events are much more tied together than I had necessarily realized. And so I'm sure I'm not going to be the only listener who is fascinated to learn about all of this in the book. Thank you so much, Mark, for joining me on the podcast.
Happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Could you start us off by introducing yourself a little bit and explain why you decided to write this book?
I am a historian of religion in early modern Europe and early America. I teach in a Center for the Study of Religion and Politics at Washington University in St. Louis, and work a lot on the intersections between religion and social and political issues across the board. My previous work was on religion and commerce, which led me into a description of merchants and how their traveling about reflected different religious positions and views. And when reading about these merchants, I became very fascinated with the fact that they often encountered people of different religious traditions. So this actually began with sheer interest in the fact that there were conversations between Protestant merchants and Muslim merchants, between Protestant settlers and indigenous American people, between Protestant travelers and a variety of Catholics, stories and tales of Dutch merchants in Asia who would tell stories and they would replicate and use them. So it really began with a sense of a fascination with these encounters between Protestants and people of different religious traditions. One of the things that struck me as I was reading this is how different those accounts sounded in the mid-17th century from the way they sounded in the mid-18th century. Different languages, different narratives, different accounts of how to think about other religions. And that really got me going on this book, which is to cut across what seemed to me to be a rather static view, that the static view being that the whole colonial period, from the beginning of the 17th century through the 18th century, was one single pattern of imperial, Western, hegemonic, racially tinged depredation upon other religious traditions. One sort of monolithic pattern. And religious studies scholars especially love essences. They love things to remain fixed. And I really was more interested in the change.
Well, that's one very clear and I think quite interesting aim of the book. Did you end up kind of starting from this point of fascination, coming up with any other aims as you did the research and wrote up the book?
As I began writing, I realized that descriptions of other religions and the relation between religious communities and political communities or political mandates also involved questions of conversion and what it meant to belong to one tradition and whether one could switch traditions. And that question of conversion got me into questions of what is the nature of religious choice what is the nature of religious liberty and freedom. So the more I worked on it, the more the question of religious liberty it came closer from the background into the center of the discussion.
All right, that's a very interesting transition in and of itself of this discussion of transformation. But before we go into more of what you found, I do want to pick up on that idea of the time period, because I mentioned it in the introduction, you mentioned it in your reasons for being fascinated. That's such a key part of this. So can you give us a bit more detail about the time period the book covers and why you've chosen these start and end dates?
From around 1650 to 1765, which is, if you will, the heart of the period of colonization after first encounters in British North America and before the American Revolution. So in my focus on London and Boston as the two nodes, geographic nodes of this study, the period of colonization itself was the period not only of encounter in North America, but also the period in which British merchants were developing overseas empire. It's the development of the empire as this cosmopolitan network that crossed oceans, where the first time under the British imperial administration, one has diplomatic officers assigned to different parts of the world. One has frequent correspondence about cultural affairs and a flush of publications, geographies, maps, studies of the world that all were early networks linking together the British Empire. So that's this period of imperial expansion, but focused on America, that led me to from the 1650 to 1765 period.
All right, so now that we've set up some useful foundations for what you're doing in the book, let's get into some of the things you figured out. So first off, can we talk about kind of some of the stakes of this? How did you find that changes in perceptions of other religions shaped the practice of really big ideas like religious liberty?
That's a great question. My sense is that we have relied too much on religious liberty as an abstract philosophical concept, John Locke, a Lockean, Republicanish series of political axioms or dictums that made religious liberty a corollary to human rights or freedoms, all of which is true. But I think that political theory remained rather abstract from political practice until Anglo-American Protestants began to think of different religious traditions as compatible with being a loyal subject of the empire. So, or to put it differently, that not all of the religions were bad and sinister, and therefore religious liberty was a very dangerous concept or limited to a fairly narrow spectrum of Protestants. That religious liberty could be broad-based. One had to have a sense that other religions were not dangerous, that there was something in common between British Protestantism and some other religious traditions. So I think the everyday experience, the encounter of merchants, the encounter of missionaries with people of different traditions is what made the notion of religious liberty less politically fraught and dangerous. It was not a contradiction to say, I'm a member of a subject of the empire and loyal to the British Empire, and at the same time can embrace the possibility of concord or solidarity with people of different religious traditions. One could do that without violating one's Englishness, one's British loyalties. So I think the change in the perception of other religions really is the key to making religious liberty a politically acceptable and even desirable notion.
Okay, so, nothing small, just actually a big deal. So now that we've established that, let's talk a little bit more about the details of this change. So, can you talk us through how the developments of empire in the 17th century changes Protestant understandings in the way that we've just discussed, but specifically understandings of key terms like idolatry, superstition, devilry? These are pretty weighted terms. How are they changing?
Well, in the 17th century, before 1688, there is an imperial project that is at the front edge of colonization. The merchant communities are at the front edge of building connections across Europe. There is a developing hostility with Catholic regimes, with France and Spain, as there's are encounters with French and Spanish forces in different parts of especially the Atlantic world. And there is in England itself the civil wars that began in the early 1640s but last through the early 1650s, up until 1660. And that period of disruption, of vulnerability, of many writings speaking of the danger of England's early imperial project, make those terms that you mentioned, devilry, idolatry, they freight them with political meaning, which is to say that idolatry is not merely a religious or spiritual term, worshiping a false god. Devilry is not only a supernatural, malevolent influence, but those terms are attached to almost every religion which is not integral to the empire itself, which is to say, magisterial British Protestantism. Magisterial meaning a form of Protestantism that venerates the magistracy, political power, legitimate government actions. And so in the 17th century, political identities, which is to say, for stability against the instability, for overcoming the trials of the Civil War, for forming a strong buttress against French and Spanish Catholic competitors, that depends on a single religious identity, British Protestant. And that single religious identity then is freighted with political meanings so that those terms, idolatry, superstition, devilry, are very heated terms that don't just describe religious or spiritual misdirection as much as they do political disloyalty.
Even more loaded then as terms.
Yeah, I think so.
You mentioned in that answer the English Civil War, and this is obviously a really big deal on a lot of levels, but I wonder if we can talk about it, how it specifically impacted how New Englanders thought about and pursued the evangelization of Native Americans.
Yeah, that's very important to the story, because when English settlers of New England develop missionary intentions and aims, and in their encounters with, especially this book focuses on New England, therefore Algonquian indigenous people groups, the assumption is that converting these people, doing missionary work among them and bringing them into the fold means that the indigenous people need to become English. That there's no way they can become Christian without becoming English first, because being English is part of the purpose of colonization and protects this fragile empire in competition with non-Protestant peoples. So when these early missionaries set out and do their first missionary work, they go after not only indigenous spiritual beliefs, but connect them to indigenous ways of life, economic patterns, agrarian patterns, domestic patterns, marriage patterns, speech and dress. And so they presume that before an indigenous person becomes accepted into the English Christian community, they must have a level of literacy, they must have a settled life, they must have a single monogamous domestic pattern, they must, in many cases, confess their fealty to the crown itself or to Parliament in the parliamentary period. So that to go back to another phrase I used, in order to become Christian, you must become English first. You must learn English moral patterns, English moral teachings, adopt an English pattern of life, and it's given a theological tone sometimes, a theological discourse sometimes, so that missionaries would say, well, you must confess your sin in order to receive forgiveness, which is one of the great dynamics of conversion, receiving forgiveness. So in order to do that, you must confess your sin, which means you must know your sin, which means you must know moral teaching. And the moral teaching that they give them is an Anglophone, if you will, exposition of the moral law of the Bible. So there's a lot of legalism, there's a lot of life structuring before the actual act of conversion and church membership takes place.
This is really quite a significant change in thinking, as you've described there, about kind of what the hoops are that one must jump through theoretically. So thank you for explaining what that difference is. But as much as I just threw some pretty big questions at you in terms of hugely important terms and big political events, you know what? I'm just going to keep going, Mark. I've got another big political event to throw at you and ask you to explain to us what the import is. Moving from the English Civil War to the Revolution, sometimes called the Glorious Revolution of 1688. How did this change these linkages that you're telling us about between ideas of being English or being part of New England and a particular idea of Protestantism?
Oh, that's a big one. That is a big one. You're right. So around 1688, and the justification for the revolution, the replacement of the old Stuart monarchy, the second generation of the Stuart monarchy, with a parliamentary monarchy, and the invitation of William and Mary to take the throne, the legitimization of that, which was massive, the amount of tracts and treatises published when William enters England in 1688 and is supported by Parliament, the amount of publications and tracts about William are phenomenal. I don't think we have a sense that they were read almost in every English church. They were published in numbers that were previously unheard of for political tracts to be published. There was a lot of polemics and political proselytization going on, if you will. Those tracts and treatises argued that religious liberty, republicanism, which was the political heart of a constitutional monarchy, included a resistance to old Stuart patterns of enforcing the hegemony of the Church of England over all things English. It implied a voluntary approach to social belonging and meaning, and therefore a year after 1689, Parliament passes the Toleration Act, which begins to encode and articulate the notion of liberty. Political liberty is also attached to religious liberty. So there is a language of toleration, of the notion of civic virtue, that attaches to this new monarchy, which is also includes the fact that William of Orange had made alliances with Catholic forces in his Netherlands, and British merchants were beginning to want alliances with Muslim traders for purposes of exchange and trade. And England itself was beginning to conceive of itself as more than the old, narrow Anglican establishment, that it itself had a liberty to expand beyond a narrow confessional basis, so that the politics of the new British state aligned with the notion of greater openness to some sort of religious variation from a standard pattern.
And was this opening up then why we see a turn towards comparative religion at this point?
Yes, because as I implied before, if you're to be tolerant towards different religions, you probably want to know what they actually say and do and teach, and see how tolerable they are in actual lived practice. But in addition to that, the new 1688, the parliamentary revolution, is also a commercial revolution. It's a revolution of trade, of navigation, of expanding markets and expanding consumer tastes, so that the geographical expansion and the interest in other peoples and the notion of a pluralistic empire that is cosmopolitan goes hand in glove throughout this whole period.
Yeah, no, that's really important. I think, as our whole discussion has demonstrated, everything's always intertwined with each other, and we have to keep remembering that. So, comparative religion then is obviously part of this. Can you tell us a bit about the key impacts of learning about the other religions and trying to figure out how tolerable they were not was?
Yes, so the first books on comparative religion come out in the 1650s, and they're very, very critical. You could, in the wake of the Civil Wars, very nervous about anything that's not English, very driving towards a central religious confession as the basis upon which the kingdom has to be based. And so they're very critical of any religious tradition that does not bear a close resemblance or affinity with the Church of England. So there's some Dutch groups, the French Huguenot groups, which are, and some German Reform group, which are barely acceptable. But everything else is chaotic and a threat and disastrous. Then a new generation of books towards the after 1688, and especially beginning of the 18th century, burst open with this sense of deep knowledge of other religious traditions without immediately categorizing them as good or bad according to some pre-existing template, but which attempts to discern the extent to which they are compatible with this pluralistic, cosmopolitan, tolerant order, which is the way they perceive the England after 1688.
Okay.
Did that answer your question?
It does, but it kind of nicely sets up my next one, because we're talking here about comparative religion and further understanding and wanting to build bridges. But you also talk about in the book that that doesn't really extend itself to Catholicism, or there's a lot of concern running around about Catholicism. So why and how does this spill over? I mean, if you're being open to these guys and not those, can you keep those separate?
No, you can't. And so first of all, the problem with Catholicism is, on the surface, one would say, well, that's because England's chief competitors and increasingly after 1688 military enemies are French and Catholic, and those competitors and or antagonists have been validated by the papacy, which delegitimates 1688, which calls English Catholics to disavow loyalty to the new monarchy. So there's some sense in which Rome itself is something of a political threat, and therefore Catholicism is held with great suspicion. It's not only that. The way these new writers of dictionaries and geographies of religion, or missionary tracts, or even diplomatic accounts, or letters of merchants, the way they portray it is there's something about Catholicism that's anti-republican. That is, it doesn't valorize or validate people's individual choices. Its appeal to, this is the Protestant reading, its appeal to mystery and ceremony, its appeal to irrational experiences in devotion to Catholic saints, Catholic rituals, the mystery of the Mass itself is conceived in high Roman Catholic thought. All of those things are written about as though they are overcoming one's reasonable choice, one's rational judgment of the world, one's moral sensibilities. They are overcoming those with an appeal to power and to ecstasy and threats of punishment. There's a lot of writing about the Inquisition, about the persecution of Huguenots in France. So it is a joint political and religious sense that Catholicism is, as a whole, anti-republican. It's opposed to liberty. It doesn't valorize people's choices. It tries to overwhelm their reasonable choices with mystery and ceremony. And this is common. And what it means is when writers write about what to them are exotic or foreign traditions, varieties of Islam, Sunni and Shia Islam, varieties of Chinese religions, Buddhism, Confucianism. When they write about those, they write about them as either Catholic-like, authoritarian, political, religious cooperation to the extent of persecution, so that priests will tell their people to be obedient to absolute sovereigns, in return for which those people get heavenly rewards. And the sovereign, in turn, tells people that if they're not obedient to this singular group of priests, they will be thrown in jail, punished, fined, and whipped. So the rhetoric, the discourse, I don't think it's true to the experience on the ground so much. This is obviously laden with political and theological agendas, but the discourse is Catholicism is absolutism. It is tyrannical. That language begins to crop up. But no, it's interesting. It's not the old Reformation era language of its superstitious or idolatrous in a spiritual way. It's that it is politically very dangerous to the English quest for liberty, as English devotees perceive it. So reading other religions through this lens, if they begin to sound or look Catholic, they are shunted aside as kind of an unjust cooperation between church and state, power and unreason in different quarters, as opposed to different religious traditions which are more tolerant and peaceful and learned and rational. Shia, certain learned groups within Shia Islam appear admirable in such lights. Certain Native American traditions appear peaceful and tolerant, and admirable in such lights, and therefore acceptable, and therefore willing to be considered. Confucianism is admired by many writers in this period, whereas the Buddhism they encounter in Tibet and in certain parts of Japan are seen as powerful in a bad way, power-seeking, ambitious, hungry, and just like Catholics. And they have their popes, is the language that's being used. Whereas the Buddhism of Thailand is revered and says, this is just like the Huguenots, this is just like good English Protestants who are tolerant.
And so those are the kind of two boxes that everything's sorted into. But as you've mentioned, the Catholic box is called different things now, which is a really, really interesting change. And it's in fact that idea of change, I'd like to kind of connect some of those dots back up again. We talked earlier about evangelizing Native American populations in New England. If we've now got this whole change going on, and that, as you've just mentioned to us, emphasizes so much these ideas of liberty and of choice,
Yes.
and the evil Catholics is overwhelming that rational make up your own mind.
Yes.
How does all of that then translate back into these questions of whether conversion is possible for Native American populations?
That's exactly the question. And the point is that the missionaries and merchants who have spiritual things in mind, who converse with indigenous people in North America, they begin to actually very self-consciously write about changes, and they develop new missionary societies which have different tactics. Those new tactics reject the old pattern of Anglicization. One must become English before one is capable of being converted. And it begins to speak much more about persuasion, about finding common moral ground, new forms of sermons and preaching, which isn't an exposition of the moral law of the Bible to bring these people into an English pattern of life, but are more expositions of tropes or images that might cross English and indigenous American boundaries, tropes from nature, sunlight, and a kind of appeal to the existential crises of life. One New England missionary, Jonathan Edwards, begins preaching about the frailty and tragedy of life to his Algonquian-speaking listeners. And he talks about the sadness of snake bites, the joy of a good harvest, as ways to bring them into the possibility of considering Christianization apart from becoming English first. So there is really a very clear to me shift in missionary tactics. It doesn't last in America. It lasts through the 1760s. And in the 18th century, it shifts yet again back to a political, moral, social conformism. So that I'm not implying that this holds forever. 19th century missionaries in America, who again are in a pattern of conquest of the continent, revert back to this notion of one must become, in this case, American before one becomes Christian. But in this period from 1720s through 1760s, there's this remarkable sense of trying to form a sense of continuities, overlaps, common moral universes.
And this goes right back to one of the aims of the project, which is to not overgeneralize the period and instead understand the nuances and the things that do change and morph within it. Even if it is a period that, as you say, doesn't last, it's still quite interesting to understand what's going on, as you've explained. So I wonder if we can continue doing that, right? Investigating kind of what actually happens and what the links are that we may be less familiar with. And so the next massive political event I'd love to throw at you, please, is ideas of American independence. That answer just now, you were talking 1720s to 1760s. So if we're continuing chronologically, what sorts of links can we see between these Anglo-American Protestant discourses that you've just told us a bit about and ideas of American independence?
Yes, one of the things that fascinated me is when I went back to the post 1765, so the beginning of rhetoric and discourse. And I'll say this book is about discourse. And I am very upfront about saying I realize that discourse is not the whole story, but it's part of the story. And I think it's a story that's been neglected. So the social life is thin in this book, but I think the discourse is important. But the discourse of revolution that begins to bubble up in the late 1760s draws on this notion that conversion is a willful choice where each individual makes a rational moral judgment about their allegiances, and just as they can shift their religious allegiances from Protestant to Catholic, which they admit happens, from Buddhist to Catholic, from Islamic to Protestant, just as though this religious change is capable and possible in this cosmopolitan world of mixture. People have the freedom to make that choice. They have the philosophical freedom as well as the political freedom to make that religious choice. So American preachers begin to argue. Americans have philosophical, political, and social capabilities of choosing their political allegiances according to their moral consciences, even in the face of inherited identities and traditions which resist that sort of change. So, as one could be born a Roman Catholic and freely choose to become a Protestant, one could be born a subject of the British Empire and freely choose to become independent through proper moral reasoning. And part of that is the recognition of one's precarious state. One is in a place of danger, as one now is, and therefore a change is necessary. A change of allegiances is beneficial and a matter of salvation, if you will. So the revolutionary generation, Jacob Duché, the chaplain of the Continental Congress in the United States, actually says in a sermon to members of Congress, you all know about religious conversion. I think you need to think what's facing us right now is a political conversion, is a conversion away from loyalty to the king to loyalty to the Continental Congress. So this notion of freedom, ability to choose, to move about, to view all the possibilities of life with an open, rational discourse, and then choose, becomes used as a way to valorize American independence for the patriot preachers.
Wow, that is really quite a direct link between the two ideas of choosing one's religion and choosing one's politics as well. So it, in some ways, hearing you describe it that way, it's like, goodness, why isn't that a link that we think more of in the historical discourse when it's really right there for us to see? And obviously even more so now that we have this book and you telling us all about it. So thank you very much for walking us through all of these linkages through this crucial time period. Before I ask you what you might be working on next, is there anything else about this book you'd like to mention?
Yeah, there is one thing that I think that intrigued me in writing this book and in working through this book, which is, well, there's two things. One is the immense amount of imagery that's being produced, engravings and pictures of other religions, other religious traditions, which have never been really examined carefully. This is just the beginning of an introduction to many of these visual pictures of religious objects, amulets, devotional objects of people praying and people dancing and people worshiping. These things are to be paid attention to too. And I think historians need to draw upon this rich imagery that comes out of this period. It is as close as we can get to today's media travelogue through foreign places, or these pictures of different religious traditions, which are remarkable. The second thing is, I think that what my book does is it tries to say, because change is important and contingency is important, contingent political conditions make religious choices, the way we think of religious choices, somewhat contingent. I think narratives which are absolutist and essentialist don't stand up well to the actual evidence. So it can be narratives from that everything was this good, wonderful English search for liberty all throughout this early modern period. I don't think so. But at the same time, this notion that the imperial colonial project is one unrelenting essence of hegemony tinged with racialized notions, that too needs to be questioned in certain places at certain times under certain conditions.
Again, the importance of nuance and detail and actually investigating the sources and figuring out what they say. So thank you for adding those pieces into our discussion. And in a lot of ways, I think they quite usefully sum up a lot of what the book is doing and what we've been talking about. So I just have one question left. What might you be working on now that this book is done?
Well, my next move, I was giving a talk about this book at a place called the American Antiquarian Society, which is a fantastic research institute in Worcester, Massachusetts. And someone said, "Have you thought about children's literature in this period?" Because one of their specializations is children's literature. So I think my next move is to try to figure out whether, to the extent to which what I'm talking about this book makes its way into very popular discourse through newspapers, through common weekly sermons, through children's books, to understand how the notion of religious liberty begins to be disseminated and experienced on a, if you will, outside of this realm of discourse that I've talked about, of high discourse that I've talked about here, and more in the realm of popular discourse. So I'm looking at children's books, more imagery, newspapers, to try to get the sense of how this works its way, if you will, through the social order.
All right, well, that sounds very intriguing. I'm sure you'll come across some fascinating images and sort of source quotations as well. So best of luck with that project. And of course, listeners can read the book we've been talking about, which perhaps will end up being kind of the first of what sounds like a duology. I mean, it sounds like in some ways you're writing the sequel. So for listeners who want to get right into what's happening here and read the whole book with all the details, it is titled The Opening of the Protestant Mind, How Anglo-American Protestants Embraced Religious Liberty, published by Oxford University Press in 2023. Mark, thank you so much for being with us on the podcast.
Miranda, it was a pleasure. I appreciate your questions and hope that this is of interest to other people as well. Thank you.